Well, good morning, church. It is good to be with you. I'm very glad that you found the sanctuary today. Each week you show up, it seems like there's a new route, a new pathway, a new construction site in the midst of everything that's going on here. It sort of reminds me of those books that I used to read when I was growing up, Choose Your Own Adventure. That's sort of like it is getting to church on some Sundays. And I understand that in the coming weeks it's going to change again. And so we will be sure to share that information with you. We are wrapping up a series this morning that we're calling Under Construction, which seems pretty appropriate. We've been talking about what it might look like in this time of construction when our building is very much under construction, what it might look like for us to build the life that we want, not just any life, but a life that you crave, that you long to live, that you were made to live. The question before us is, what does it mean for you right now, wherever you are in life, to construct the life that you want to construct before God? The text that we're going to look at this morning as we enter into this last sermon in this series is from the epistle to the Hebrews. Now, epistle is a fancy word that means quite literally letter, and so this is a letter to the Hebrews. It's attributed to the Apostle Paul, though there is some question amongst scholars on whether or not he actually wrote it. It's attributed to him. It's certainly in the style of Paul. And while there's still some discussion about who wrote it, what it's about is quite clear. That it was written to a group of Jewish Christians who lived in Jerusalem, and they were facing a great deal of persecution. And so the purpose of the letter was to encourage these Christians to persevere in the face of everything that was going on around them. We'll be reading from the 11th chapter, and at the beginning, we're not going to read the whole chapters, but in the beginning of the chapter, Paul speaks about the role of faith in our life. He defines and gives us a great handle on what faith is. And in between, when we pick up later towards the end of this chapter, he gives us all sorts of examples of people of great faith, people like Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Jacob and others, many others, these ancestors of our faith that endured incredible trials and hardships, but in the midst of it, they maintained their faith. And then at the very end, he tells us what is offered to them for doing just that. So I invite you to hear this word from Hebrews chapter 11.
The scripture this morning is from the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. It is the 11th chapter, verses 1 and 2, and it skips down to 32 to 40. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Here begins the reading. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and in holes in the ground. Yet, all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Here ends the reading, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Well, that sort of puts all the construction mess in perspective, doesn't it? All the things that they faced. So my friend Jim passed away a few months ago. He was a member of the church that I served in Atlanta. And he actually was a graduate of TCU, and so we used to talk about all things purple. He had a beautiful wife by the name of Marilyn, and he told me one time that when they first got married, now over 50 years ago, they came to an agreement. The agreement was that she was going to make all of the small decisions in their lives, and that he, as the man of the family, was going to make all of the big decisions. He told me, he says, we've been married for 30 years. We've had 3 kids. I've had 4 job changes. We've moved cross country twice, and not once have I got to make a big decision. How many of us know what that's like? Who've discovered that sometimes things happen that are beyond our control. Now, Jim wasn't complaining, he was just joking, but there were times when some of those things that would go on to bring him great joy. He had 3 great children that turned into adults that produced for him grandchildren. But some of the things that moved his life down the path that he envisioned for himself, he felt like they were happening to him, rather than him being the driver of the bus down the path that he was on. How many of us know a little bit about what that's like? Things happen. It's how life is. It's a journey. It's constantly moving forward. It's why way back 4,000 or 400 years before Jesus, the great Greek philosopher says that the only constant in life is change. The only constant in life is change. But we all know that change is hard. Change is hard. We know that. Change is uncomfortable, and we love being comfortable. Things get a little hot, we turn down the thermostat. If it gets a little cold, we turn it back up. We like to be comfortable. We have comfort food. We have comfort clothes. We like comfort. But change is uncomfortable, which is why Mark Twain, the great philosopher, once said, "The only one who likes change is a baby with a wet diaper." But I would argue that whether we like change or not is the wrong question. Change is inevitable. As I said, the only constant in life. And to live is to grow, and to grow is to change. And all of us are going to experience great changes in our lifetime. But what determines the joy, the satisfaction, the meaning, the purpose that we discover in that life is how we are going to adapt to those changes. Charles Darwin once said, "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent that survive. It's always the ones that are most adaptable to change." Several years ago, I was working on my doctorate, and I did my dissertation on life transitions. And one of the leaders in that field was a professor at Mills College in California by the name of William Bridges, and he wrote a fascinating book simply entitled Transitions, and the subtitle was Making Sense of Life's Changes. Bridges suggests that it's not the changes in life that do us in, it's the transitions. And he distinguished the difference between the two, between change and transition. He says change is situational, it's external. It's the move to a new home, a new job. It's having a child, a pivot in our career, or maybe even retirement. But a transition is that internal process that as we go through, we come to terms with a new situation that each change brings with it. Change is external. Transitions are internal. And that external change only takes fully hold when that internal transition takes place. He says, essentially, that there are 3 stages in every transition. The first is an ending. And I know what you may be thinking, an ending. No. Change starts with a new beginning. But what Bridges says is that each transition starts with an ending. We often think of something, changes beginning with something new, but before something new can begin, something old has to pass. And then once that ending has occurred, then we enter into this middle ground, what he refers to as the neutral zone, until we can finally be ready for that new beginning to take place. Let me give you an example of having a child. Nothing changes your life more than having a child, and mostly for the better. But there's also some grieving that takes place, isn't there? Because no longer are you free just to pick up and go away for the weekend. You can't grab a beer with the boys on the way home from work. You have to come to the realization that the way in which you've been living your old life is gone. That time in your life has ended. Change begins with an ending. But once you come to grips with that ending, you're thrown into the neutral zone, the liminal space, he might calls it, and that tends to be the most scary, the most uncomfortable, because there's filled with unknowns, and that's when we experience the stress, the strains, the pulls, the tensions, the anxieties. And if you've ever had a baby, you know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of stress and mess and long nights and short days. There's a lot of unknowns in the midst of that. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to be around the next corner. Larry Ivy is a church member. I'm not sure if he's here this morning. Yeah, he is right here in the front row. Larry is a church member, and each Sunday he sort of hovers around after everybody leaves, and when I'm greeting people, he always comes to me last because he's always got the most thoughtful, intelligent, I'm building you up, Larry, the most thoughtful, the most intriguing, compelling story or metaphor or anecdote based on my sermon. And a couple of months ago, back in March, I was doing a series on following in the footsteps of Jesus. And he talked to me about driving one time in England, and he happened upon this sign that caught his attention. There was construction ahead, and this sign was a warning sign, and it simply said, "Changed priorities ahead." Only the English would put it that way. Changed priorities ahead. Sometimes things happen in our lives that change everything, even our priorities. At least this one came with a little bit of a warning, right? Most oftentimes, we don't get that. Let me give you another example. Graduation. My twins, Jake and Ella, both graduated from college just last month. And Jake will start a new job in a couple of weeks, and Ella will begin graduate school in Oregon later this summer. And I could not be more thrilled and more proud of them and what they're doing in their life. But I'm also aware that in the midst of that celebration, there's also a little bit of worry. There's a little bit of tension. There's a little anxiety about what happens next. Or think about a high school graduate that all of a sudden getting ready to go off to college. High school has ended. They are no longer the big kids on campus where things are familiar, where they know their teachers, where they're secure in their friends. And so the summer is this sort of neutral zone. But again, underneath, there's a little bit of stress and worry. But then school will start, and then we'll be filled with new beginnings and new friends and new opportunities, new learnings. It'll be a new life. You know, as I look at my life, some of the biggest mistakes that I have made was because I rushed from an ending to a beginning without doing the important work required in the midst of that liminal zone. I rushed from the ending to the new beginning and was in worse shape than I was in the first place. And I did that because I was seeking to avoid that middle ground that's filled with emptiness, with worry, with question marks, with ambiguity. And so whether you're having a child or starting a new school, all of us experience that stress, the strains, the pulls, the problems. But ultimately, if we don't wrestle with those, if we try to avoid those uncomfortable places, we miss out on the fullness and the possibilities of that new life that is entrusted to us. Pema Chodron is a Buddhist monk, and she wrote a book called Comfortable with Uncertainty. And in it, she says this: we try to control the uncontrollable by looking for security and predictability, always hoping to be comfortable and safe. But the truth is, we can never avoid uncertainty. And this not knowing is part of the adventure. But it's also what makes us afraid. It's the not knowing that makes for the uncertainty. And I would argue also that it's also where faith comes in. Do you remember what Paul said? The very definition of faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, or as another translation puts it, faith is our handle on what we can't see. And then he goes on to give examples of people of faith that have gone before us and went through some uncertainty, some pain, some stress, some worry, but yet in the midst of it, they held on to their faith. And in the end, they discovered that they received not what they wanted, what they were working for, but something different, something better. That's what Paul said at the end of the chapter that was read. God had a better plan for them. And I would argue that God has a better plan for us. It's just that sometimes we can't see it in the moment, and that's where faith comes in. You know, as I look back at my life, all of the dreams that I had, I was going to play shortstop for the San Francisco Giants. All of the dreams that I had, the prayers that I prayed, all of the things that I wanted that never came. The relationships that I pursued that never materialized. And I look back at all of the pain that those things caused in that moment by these unrealized desires. These prayers that went unanswered. But now I look at my life with my amazing, beautiful family, the opportunity to serve alongside and to be church with you all, being here, all of it, so much better than I could have ever dreamed. It's like that old Garth Brooks song, "Thank God for Unanswered Prayers." You know, I've heard it said that 2/3 of the world lives on Saturday, between Good Friday and Easter. 2/3 of the world lives on Saturday between Good Friday and Easter. It's a metaphorical way of saying that most of us live in that liminal space between the end, some sort of death, and the beginning of something new. That much of life is spent between the already and the not yet, and that is most oftentimes a difficult place to be because we yearn for something new, for something to make sense in the midst of all the chaos. Sometimes the most faithful thing that we can do is to simply make room for an unknown future to fill up our lives with yet to come surprises. I remember hearing the story once of a hotel that had beautiful gardens, and people would come from all over to see these gardens, and they had a beautiful light show, sort of light system as well. But trying to save electricity, they installed a motion sensor. And at night, as people would come, there was a little sign just at the beginning of the path that said, "With your first step into the darkness, the lights will come on." Sometimes, all it takes to build the life that we long for is a single step. As someone once said, we can't be afraid of change. And you may feel very secure in the pond that you're in, but if you never venture out of that, you will never know that there is such thing as an ocean or a sea. Holding on to something that is good for you now may be the very reason that you don't have something better. May we know that to be true in our life together as we journey towards all that God envisions for us, that God calls us into, that God dreams for our lives as we build the life that we long for. Amen.